So about a week ago, I tested out a new series where it was the regional differences between Zelda 2 in the US and Japan, and it went over really well. You guys seem to like it a lot, so I went right back to it with one of my favorite games of all time, Earthbound. So just like last episode, we're going to break this off into 6 categories, and the first category we're going to go with is the boxes or packaging. As you can probably already tell from the side-by-side shot, they couldn't be any more different. First, let's start with Earthbound. You might notice that the box is enormous. This distinction makes it one of the most collectible Super Nintendo boxes of all time. And the reason for its size is that if you pull out the contents of the box, you're gonna find a player's guide. And in the center of this cardboard skeleton is the game itself. Now, we'll get back to the player's guide in a moment, but let's take a quick look at the Mother 2 box. Now, it's a little bit difficult to show off on camera, but the lettering on the box protrudes from the box itself, giving the lettering a sense of depth. Hopefully you can see that. Now when we look at the contents of the box, you have the game manual to start with, the Super Famicom card, and a dense card that shows off the game's controls. Now let's go back to that player's guide so we can do a side-by-side comparison of a couple things that I thought were really interesting between the two. I'm trying not to focus too much on the player's guide because I feel like a lot of fans already know the entire contents of this thing. But just to go over some of the more interesting aspects of it, it came with scratch and sniff cards, and it features way more clay models than the manual for Mother 2. But Mother 2 had some really interesting stuff as well. Something I wasn't expecting, actually. As you can see by my reaction here on stream. Foggy Land, Eagle Land. I didn't know that. Dude, I'm learning so much tonight. And yeah, let's talk about this page. It shows off the entire world of Earthbound, and it revealed something I actually never knew about Earthbound. I knew about Eagle Land, of course, because it's mentioned at the start of the game, but then there were 2 other areas here that I had no idea about. For example, Foggy Land and Chomo. It also features all the regional differences in the naming of all the individual areas of the game. A couple that I won't be featuring later in the episode is Rama instead of Dalam, and Doko Doko Desert instead of Dusty Dunes Desert. And there are 2 huge differences in the clay models. One of which I want to say for a little bit later, but one that's appropriate for now is that the clay model for Ness was changed in the US version. The Japanese clay model was used as a base for how Ness would look in Super Smash Bros. In the future, whereas the US version was probably changed to make the character look a little more mature so that Western players could connect with the main character a little better. Now, like I said, we're going to revisit what's in the player's guide and manual later, but let's go back to the boxes. So in the US, we titled it Earthbound, whereas in Japan, it was the sequel, Mother 2. But there's also a teeny tiny bit of text next to it that you might not have even noticed, and that's the game's subtitle. And in full, it reads out as Mother 2 Gig no Gakusho, which when translated could be interpreted a couple different ways, but that's the perfect segue into our next topic, which is translation differences. See, at the startup of Earthbound, you get this War of the World looking image and it's titled as Earthbound, the War Against Gygus. And whereas in the US version, this message pops up nowhere else, in the Japanese version, players instead were greeted with the full title of the game, and conveniently enough, written out in English, which is Mother 2 Gig Strikes Back, followed by the title screen that essentially says the same thing. And of course, let's talk about the differences here as well. Over in Japan, it's called the Mother series, and this is the second game in the series, and the series tends to have a theme of red in the background. However, Earthbound has a purple background and does not feature the planet Earth in its logo. And funny enough, there's actually even more to talk about here, but we're just going to save that for a different category in this episode, so stay tuned. Now, the meat and potatoes of this category isn't visually stimulating, but there's a couple of really big differences in how the game is translated that completely changes the context of certain characters or phrases. And no, I don't speak Japanese. I do want to say real quick that I did use a reference for this topic alone. I want to thank Clyde Mandolin and his website, The Legends of Localization. And it turns out that he's also published a region break-like book for Earthbound, which I have now ordered and it's on its way, and I'll leave a link to that in the description down below. But anyways, let's get to it. Buzz Buzz the bee, right at the start of the game? Well, a bee he is not. In the US version, he's described as having the depiction of a bee, which is a far more common insect in the United States. However, in the Japanese version, he states his appearance as a rhino beetle, which large beetles are far more popularized and adored in Japan. Now here's something that you can actually look at in this category. Normally, the sign here would say Berglund Park over in Tucson, but in Japan it's Nosuto Park, which isn't too dissimilar from what it ended up being in the US version. When translated, it just basically says Burglar Park. And then this was a pretty fun discovery on my own end. Over in the US, an item is used by Jeff called the Bottle Rocket, and it has 3 tiers in total. There's the Bottle Rocket, the Big Bottle Rocket, and then the Multi-Bottle Rocket. But over in Japan, it's called a Pencil Rocket, not a Bottle Rocket. And its 3 tiers are Pencil Rocket, 5 pencil rockets, and then 20 pencil rockets. This explains why the rockets look the way that they do, with Jeff's assist trophy in Super Smash Bros. And then one key location gets a total name change that I feel changes how you perceive this area entirely. In the US, this area with all these dinosaurs and prehistoric aspects to it is called the Lost Underworld. However, in Japan, it's called the Continent in the Depths of the Earth. And then there's this part in the game in the US version where you find a carrot key and put it into the rabbit statues. Now, these rabbits are still statues in Japan, but the item used to make them disappear is not a key, and instead it's just referred to as Rabbit's favorite carrot. The photographer in Earthbound that has that famous phrase, "say fuzzy pickles," doesn't say fuzzy pickles at all in Mother 2. Surprisingly, the food item in Japan is cheese sandwich. And then when you beat the game, if you go to the cafe in Forside, you can find Pokey's dad. Well, in the US version, Pokey's dad says, "Don't tell my wife and Onette that I've been spending my time here." Well, in the Japanese version, Pokey's dad says, "Keep it an absolute secret from my wife and Onette that I've been boozing it up here." Which we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. There is definitely a reason why he says that in this building. Now, it's interesting that he says, "my wife," because that's going to carry us over into our next topic, which is controversy. But before that, I just have a quick message. One that's pretty important because mentioning it in the past has basically saved the channel at this point. And we are so close to having the views back to what they used to be before this whole situation. So I'll just mention it one more time. Back in August, for some reason, YouTube flipped some weird switch on my channel, and it caused the viewership on this channel to become a third of what it used to be overnight. It took about 6 months to realize that before August, 90% of the views were coming from non-subscribers, and now it keeps balancing it out to 50-50. It's still unbelievably rare that you get suggested a video from my channel right now, and by subscribing, it increases your chances of being shown a video on the homepage or the sidebar by about a 1 in 14 chance. Thank you for allowing me to mention this one last time, and let's move on. So what was that controversial moment that we were talking about? Well, in Earthbound, if you visit Pokey's house, there's a strange man inside of it, and he refers to Pokey's mom as a Ms. instead of a Mrs., implying that she's divorced. However, in Mother 2, Pokey's father refers to her as his wife still, just like it does in the US version, but this stranger in the house refers to her as Mrs., which of course you're allowed to connect your own dots, but a lot of people, including myself, seem to think that this indicates infidelity, and that changing Mrs. to Ms. tries to imply that she's divorced in the US version. Now, alright, now hopefully I haven't been boring you up to this point, because this is where the episode starts to get really good. Now, why would Pokey's father be boozing it up in a cafe? Well, because in the Japanese version, it's not a cafe. In fact, on the outside of the building, it reads as a bar in Mother 2, whereas in Earthbound, it's referred to as a cafe. And there's a lot of references to alcohol in the Japanese version of Mother 2 as well. And we're not even done with Pokey's father. The localizers for Mother 2 decided to change a sound effect when Pokey and Picky get punished by their father. In this scene in the US version, they go upstairs and you hear a spank noise, which isn't quite as brutal as the sound effect used in Mother 2. Go ahead and take a listen. And yeah, I think it's safe to say that Pokey didn't really have a great childhood. And so now moving on from that, we're going to talk about the Happy cultists. At a certain point in the game in Earthbound, you stumble upon a town that has been overrun by a cult. And this cult is obsessed with the color blue. Now, a lot of the cult mentality is not lost in Earthbound, and that's great. I love that. However, they seem to think that in the Japanese version, they push the imagery of the happiest a little too far. I don't think I need to explain why they had to make this change, but in Mother 2, the cultists had 2 H's on their forehead, and the hood was simply a hood. Whereas in Earthbound, they added a poof ball on the end to, I think, maybe try to give the implication of a nightcap. They also removed the H's from the forehead. In fact, these changes are applied to the player's guide as well, though the H's are hilariously whited out instead, and they left the white mark in. Were these changes enough to avoid any implications? I don't think so, but at least they tried. And relative to what I just shared with you, the town of Threed was originally Threek in Mother 2, and it seems to be widely accepted that the reason why it was changed from Threek to Threed is that the localizers didn't want anybody to read the name out as 3K. Alright, so now I'm about to show you what is featured in the thumbnail, and I do feel like I should give you a little bit of a warning. If you do want to skip it, there is a timestamp right here if you really feel sensitive about it. But I should state that the simplicity of the art is about the same as like a troll doll or Mr. Krabs.
Good grief, he's naked!
So as long as you have a mental maturity about it and you understand that it's basically safe for work, you should be okay. And with that said, I was pretty shocked too, so why don't we take a look at it? Uh-huh. Hey, look, I tried my best to warn you, okay? But alright, why is he like this? Well, the area that you're in at this part of the game is all within Ness's mind. And within Japanese games and anime, it is incredibly common for characters that are represented in a metaphysical world to shed anything that would be added to them in the physical world. It also just needs to be stated that Japanese culture is a lot more open-minded about this subject than Americans. The way that the localizers dealt with this subject is they just gave Ness his pajamas back, the same that he used at the beginning of the game. Now, before we move out of Magic Camp, let's move on to the next category, culture. Now, this isn't necessarily any changes made to correct anything or cover up a controversy, but rather to make some adjustments that get the same idea across while culturally making sense to Americans. And allow me to immediately contradict myself by showing you this absurd change. In Magic Camp, you have an ATM machine, but it's not called an ATM machine, instead it's a thing with eyes. However, in Japan, it says CD, which stands for cash dispenser. Now, cash dispenser is a phrase that can be used in the US, but it's not as common as an ATM. And you will find the abbreviation for CD in the Saturn Valley as well. But it doesn't end there. There's a separate room inside the hotels to collect cash from, and there's a sign above the door. In Japan, it reads card, but in the US, it's ATM. Now, in Earthbound, there are two statues. There is a pencil statue, and then there is an eraser statue. And the fun little gimmick with this is that you have to get an invention called the pencil eraser or the eraser. But in Japan, it's way different. Instead of the pencil statue, it's an octopus statue. Now, a pencil statue is already absurd, but an octopus statue is a little too absurd for an American audience. Whereas the octopus is a little more common in Japanese culture, it matches the tone of everyday life a little bit better. And then the next statue really caught me off guard. But one day, ooh, that's new. What is that thing? After being informed by my chat and doing some research on my own, this thing is called the Kokeshi statue. Now, what is a Kokeshi? Apparently one of the oldest style of toys in Japan are these wooden dolls, and the Japanese would carve them into characters. This is something that they still do to this day, and due to the long-standing history and relevancy that exists in Japan to this very moment, a Kokeshi statue isn't any more bizarre than an eraser statue here in the US. The reason why it is a Kokeshi statue is because the word eraser in Japanese is keshi, and so the idea was to have a little bit of wordplay. To match this as best as we could in the US, localizers just made a giant eraser that needs to be erased. It's not quite the same, but it shares a similar spirit. And then in Japan, they have very strange onomatopoeias, ones that we don't use here in the US. And so when Pokey is knocking on the door at the start of the game, there's a little speech bubble that says don don don. Localizers worrying that maybe the player would interpret this as the character saying don out loud, they changed it to an exclamation point. And then there's another change to a name for a town in the game, Skaraba. Originally in Mother 2 it was known as Skarabi, and my best guess here was that this name was changed to sound a little more Egyptian to American audiences. And then there's the parts of the game where you're supposed to put in your real life name. In Earthbound you put in your real life name back in Summers, and then when you get to the Tenda village, it just asks you to confirm if the name was correct again. Mother 2 is very different. When you're in Summers, the game asks its Japanese speaking audience to put their name in English, and then when you reach the Tenda village, the game tries to translate that English name into Japanese characters, which you can then modulate if you really need to. And then this plays itself later on into the game, where when you face off against Gygus, the game uses the Japanese real life name, and then after the credits are over in the game, it then uses the English version that you put in at Summers. Now, we already talked about a correction in this category, but let's move on to the next category, which is solely dedicated to corrections. These are changes that would likely be in the Japanese version if they had the foresight to make it this way in the first place. And the first one I want to show you is the Hint Man. In the Japanese version, every single booth has a $5 bill on it, indicating what the price should be, but then when you go to talk to the Hint Man, there's various different prices throughout the game. This was changed in the US version to just not have any specific amount on the sign at all. And then there's the title screen skip. Surprisingly, in the Japanese version, at any point you can mash the start button and it'll take you straight to the file select screen. Whereas in the US version, mashing the start button will bring you to the title screen first, and then you can go to the file select screen, which pretty much allows every single boot up the game to feel a little more personable. Back and forth side, the department store in Japan says department across the building, which is not something anybody says. To fix this in the US version, they just made a short handle for the word department and replaced the rest of the characters with store instead. When you win a battle in the game in the Japanese version, it says you win. However, slightly better grammar would be you won, which is what it was changed to in the US. And then this last one, it's hard to say if this is really a correction. I just decided to put this in here because it's a little bit of a conversation. Over in Winter's Dr. Andonut's lab says Labo on the front in Mother 2. Now your first instinct would be, oh, that's just straight up a typo. But no, the term Labo is really popular in Japan. But since Labo is not in the dictionary, you may or may not think, okay, sure, it's popular in Japan, but it's still bad English. Well, okay, fine. But what if I told you this was not a shorthandle for an English word? Labo is a proper shorthandle of the word laboratoire, which also means laboratory, but just in French. This could technically be the only French word in Mother 2, and Japan is totally fine with that. Anyways, let's move on to my favorite category, saving the best for last. Not the smart YouTuber thing to do, but whatever. Copyright. Now, there's a good group of examples here where the Japanese developers of Mother 2 really pushed the line of other people's copyright. And so the localization team seems to have been tasked with being overtly cautious about it, making as many changes as possible. These trucks over here say come, but the logo is a little too similar to Coca-Cola, and so in the US it's changed to a white silhouette of a man. The Monotoli building in Forside is going to absolutely flip you on your head as to how it should be properly pronounced when you look at it in Japanese. Does that word look familiar? Just replace the T with a P and it says monopoly. So truthfully, you should be pronouncing this building as Monotoli. However, like I said in the US, to divert attention away from the similarities, they replaced the Y with an I. And right down the street in the Japanese version, there is the Topolo Theater, which is too similar to the New York theater, the Apollo. So in Earthbound, they called it Topola. And then there's the Red Cross. Believe it or not, that Red Cross is not public domain. The Red Cross organization has full rights to it, and they are not shy about taking people to court who use that image. So in the US, they had to remove it entirely, which must have been a ton of work because it's on every hospital and every nurse and every map that you have in Mother 2. And then there's the Runaway 5, one of the highlight characters of the entire game. Their influence from the Blues Brothers is still very apparent in the US version. I know that I certainly made that comparison before. But it turns out in Japan, it's way more derivative than you would have thought. All the members of this group, instead of wearing vibrant colors, instead wore black, all black. And the name Tonzura Brothers translates to Runaway Brothers. Obviously, the big change there was to get rid of the word brothers, because then you have that strong connection to Blues Brothers. Now, even if this wasn't an issue, the localizers still wouldn't be able to run away from this issue, which is that they had to translate Tonzura to runaway. And therefore, the marquees in front of buildings, as well as on the side of the bus, need to be swapped out from Tonzura to runaway. And we'll leave it on this note, because it's pretty fitting. When you beat Mother 2, it says to be continued at the very end. Whereas the localizers for Earthbound, I guess, are just a bunch of prophets telling us Americans the end. Question mark? Honestly, it's pretty scary how well that matches up to the current state of Mother 3 here in the US. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. If you want to be part of the creative process for future episodes, consider catching one of my streams on Twitch. The community over there is still very small and very awesome, and it would be awesome to hang out with you. Also, the release of the first episode seems to have inspired a YouTuber to come out of a 5-year retirement to finally continue his series that is very similar to this one. He has a couple of episodes that have already been out for about 5 years. His name is Josh Call, and I'm going to leave a link to his channel down below as well, and I wish him the best with his return. Lastly, yes, PAL Regions will be featured on this show. It's weird how many people thought otherwise and also were very upset by it. And the next video I plan to produce is going to be a Boundary Break episode.